Well, we're here to talk about an excerpt from a prose poem by Leslie Scalapino, and I'm joined here by Lily. Hello, Lily.
Hi, Al.
Good to see you as always. Davy, hi.
Hey, Al.
Erica, hey there. How are you?
Hey, Al.
And Camara, hi, Camara.
Hey.
It's good to see you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think I'll ask Davy to very briefly give us a little bibliographical setup. Where's this from? And then Davy will read the piece, and then we'll just talk about it. So Davy, take it away.
Sure. So this is an excerpt from a poem called The Coming Sequence, which is part of Scalapino's first full-length collection, considering how exaggerated music is, which was published by North Point Press in 1982. And Erica, you can help me out here, but the scene that I imagine is the East Bay, Berkeley in the late 70s and early 80s, in the early moments of the West Coast version of language poets. So you can think about that as your background.
Yeah, I think it's really just what you said is so great in having the Scalapino piece join some of the other language pieces, because the Bay Area is important, and because Scalapino takes a somewhat different but also somewhat similar approach to the whole question of social observation. So,
and
yeah, go ahead.
And Scalapino might well have objected to my or our using the term language, but that's something that we can talk about and talk about why we might think about it as in dialogue with language poems, even though we might hesitate about or at least discuss whether or not we want to use the term language poetry to discuss this.
Exactly.
In any case, though, I'll go ahead and read it so we can talk about it.
Okay, thank you, Davy.
Coming sequence. I was in a downtown area, and the sense that I had of someone on the street was that she wasn't spending money, or at any rate hadn't spent any that day. She still had some money on her and was wearing ordinary clothes, so that I had the feeling that I didn't want to talk to anyone then. There wasn't anything I wanted to buy either, and I had some money with me. She should be shopping rather than myself, and she was walking rather fast so that she was with people ahead of me. The sense I had of a man on the street was that he had a family, yet was ambivalent toward the place or setting at that moment, an area where there were small businesses and restaurants, and not where he lives. There shouldn't be any sex, say. He should be in a normal state and have no sex actually occurred then, or around that time, and then have it occur later, have slower ability. A retarding of his ability in general, not just in this setting, and have other people who were there wearing everyday clothes, walking some. I saw a man coming out of a grocery store carrying a package of sweet rolls, or at any rate something that was sweet. He might live in one of the houses in the area. I bought some milk and a few things, and I just had a feeling of wanting to throw them away, the thought coming to me, though I just bought them. I had something I had to do later. I began walking, and people were at a bus stop, as if they were not going to work, but were going out for a while, for part of the afternoon. This was in a business area, and there were shops. People sat waiting at the bus stop in the sun, and there was no traffic going by at the time, so I had the sense that they should be satisfied sexually by others, and not by me or the others there. They shouldn't move, or should walk around some, though their sexual life should occur with someone from outside. I saw some men doing construction work in the street, and the feeling I had was that they shouldn't do the work then or walk around. There should be a lack of skill, or at any rate no movement occurring, so that the surroundings were not pleasant, and the area they were in then was affluent, was well off. Someone who ordinarily was skilled at the time has a lessening or crippling of his ability, so that he comes sexually, and people just walking around have the sensation, only not strong.
Thank you, Davy. Why don't we all go around and just offer one thought on the mode or technique or approach to making social observation. And social observations include the speaker's assumptions about class standing, where one resides, and so forth. So who wants to start? Lily, can you say one thing that's on your mind about this social observation here?
Yeah, I want to say that basically every sentence or most sentences and observations are grounded in the speaker's I, like first person POV. So it's not saying that man did this or whatever. It's like the sense I had was that he was this way or was doing this. So it's very grounded in the speaker's subjectivity.
So it's foregrounding the fact that this is an observation being made on the basis of some assumptions, which is a certain level of self-consciousness about social standing.
Right.
Camara, what's your thought about the way social observation works here?
Well, to build off what Lily is saying, there's also in many of the language a sort of feeling of guessing, or like the might have happened. There's not often like a certainty ascribed to what the speaker is observing. Yeah.
Yeah, a great and somewhat minor example of that would be, I saw a man coming out of a grocery store carrying a package of sweet rolls, or at any rate, something that was sweet. So that you wouldn't normally worry about accuracy, you know, sweet rolls or sweetness, it's probably the same, but there's an emphasis on, I'm making assumptions and I want you to know I'm making assumptions, even as trivial as that. Erica, social observation, what are your thoughts about that?
It's interesting. I mean, building on this idea of accuracy, there are certain words that are really playing with the very idea of making assumption. So like the sense that I had, like the emphasis on sense. And then in the second section that we're looking at, sense morphs into feeling. So it feels like there's something happening there that's an attempt to defamiliarize the way that we usually would read a text that appears to be making social observations.
Wonderful. Davy, your thought on social observation. Then I want to throw a question at you, Davy, to start another round of thought.
Something that's so interesting to me about this excerpt in dialogue with how it makes social observation is that it's so embedded in language of both sexuality and disability. We get the language of ability 3 times. We get these like pretty troubling usages of crippling his ability. We get the language of retarding of his ability, which I hope we get to talk about, in which very frequently like the speaker is imagining what people's sexual lives are like beyond the observation that they're making in the present. And the language that's available to think about what people are like in their sexual behavior is the language of disability. And the idea of what someone's normal state might be and how engagement in sexuality becomes a kind of enactment of disability, which is so complicated and troubling, and is something that I hope we get to talk about. But how social observation is embedded in the language of disability is so interesting to me here.
Well, I was going to go in a different direction, but what you said was so suggestive, Davy, that I'll throw this out to you and others. Is there a relationship between those troubling assumptions? This is a speaker, it's not necessarily Leslie Scalapino. You know, this person is making some, let's just use the word profiling in the largest general sense. The speaker is thinking about the profile of the people that she sees and making assumptions. Is there a connection between this assumption about ability, skill, crippling, lessening of ability on one hand, those kinds of assumptions, and on the other hand, assumptions such as, do they belong in this neighborhood? Do they live here? Where do they live? Is there a relationship, Davy? Kind of a leading question, but.
It's such a good question. And it will be no shock to you that I want to answer it obliquely by not answering it. Constellate here additionally, whether or not people belong in this neighborhood, their relationship and the viewpoint of the speaker to questions of disability, and the speaker's own like total discomfort with capitalism, of thinking about whether or not they want to spend money, of having objects and wanting to throw them away out of what I read as a kind of disgust for participating in capitalism. And something that we might think about with the question that you're asking, Al, about whether this language of disability is related to belonging in neighborhoods is how this language of disability is also signaling towards a kind of larger sense of social refusal, of a speaker both interested in participating in a set of social systems and like really repulsed, like interested in observing the normative and really repulsed by the normative, whether the normative is heterosexuality, whether the normative is participation in capitalism. That on the one hand, we have the speaker saying like, I saw this person, she bought some groceries and I hate that I have to buy groceries. Capitalism is awful.
Yes. That's great. Great start on this topic. Camara, I'm going to read the final stanza / paragraph and ask you to say anything about it at all. This is the construction work person who is either skilled or not skilled, but the location of a construction worker in this neighborhood either confuses the speaker or causes the speaker to think more about social belonging. So here we go. I saw some men doing construction work in the street, and the feeling I had was that they shouldn't do the work then or walk around. There should be a lack of skill. There should be a lack of skill, or at any rate, no movement occurring, so that the surroundings were not pleasant and the area they were in then was affluent, was well off. Someone who ordinarily was skilled at the time has a lessening or crippling of his ability so that he comes sexually, and people just walking around have this sensation, only not strong. Well, there's a lot of, there's some Gertrude Steinian stuff going on in the way the phrases are delivered, but I want to leave that aside for a second. Can you help us understand what's happening here in this observation of the construction worker and the affluent neighborhood and all this other stuff?
Maybe we can do that collectively, because this last stanza is difficult for me. But I think that starting with the first sentence, I saw some men doing construction work in the street, and the feeling I had was that they shouldn't do the work then or walk around. Reminds me of exactly what Davy was talking about earlier in terms of a sort of disgust at the working that the construction people are doing in the street, but also, which makes me think of the labor and the capitalism as well. But at the same time that the speaker has this feeling that they shouldn't be working in that way, they shouldn't also be walking around, which to me thinks about belonging in the neighborhood as well. Shouldn't be there, which also makes me uncomfortable. Why and how does this speaker not think they should be working, which seems like critique of capitalism, but also not belonging? Yeah.
Wow, Camara, you started out by saying you didn't know what to do with this, and then you wowed us with some
Start from the beginning.
That's really fun. Your comments suggested to me, I'm going to turn to Lily next. Comments suggested to me the phrase skilled laborer. And when you think about someone operating in an affluent neighborhood who is a skilled laborer, you think of them as staying on the job, maybe taking a quick break, but for the most part, not participating in the pedestrianism of what it's like to move through a neighborhood, with an affluent neighborhood with shops and so forth. So you got to stay still. And the speaker is clearly uncomfortable with trying to identify that. And the word skilled, Davy, is associated with the lessening or crippling of ability. So the very thing, skill, that makes them identifiable as staying put and doing their job and not participating in the affluence is also the thing that gets lessened and turns into disability. And so disability becomes very radical because they're doing something they're not supposed to do in an affluent neighborhood by just walking around. And if you're really disabled, walking around, just walking around is a problem. So we're in this fabulous sociological circle. Lily, what do you want to do with that last stanza? It's pretty cool.
I agree. And the one that I connected it most with was the, I guess, third stanza, or the second stanza break, the one that starts with the sense I had of a man on the street. And the reason that I kind of paired these sections was that earlier piece seems to talk about the difference between like a residential area and a commercial area, and that being tagged very sort of violently and sexually separated those two different spaces. And like, I felt that the last stanza did a similar thing about not just like a sociological division of labor, but how those things are mapped onto the way a city is zoned and built to separate these different things that are normal parts of life and maybe shouldn't be separated all out together.
Yeah. Erica, will you take it from here? Any thoughts on this, what we've been saying just now?
Yeah, it's interesting because I have a tendency to, and I'm sure this will come as no surprise to you, Al, but I have a tendency to really look at Scalapino's earlier work like this with an eye on what she's trying to do with syntax and narrative. And it seems to me that there's a lot happening here that's pretty intentionally trying to get the reader to feel both inside of a story and also totally dislocated from time and place.
Yes.
There are these words that are referential, and there's this I that appears to be making assumptions. But if we try and dig in and figure out a concrete story, or even, you know, like who these assumptions are being directed at beyond the kind of vague characterizing that happens,
Yeah.
we can't. So
Yeah.
there's this way that the way that she's narrating in these little prose blocks, she's kind of turning hierarchies in on themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's really great. Gee, that puts me in mind of a kind of a question or a kind of ModPo game is the wrong word, but a ModPo thing I was hoping we would do for the next few minutes is I'll toss out some comparisons that might be fortunate for us, productive for us. I'll start with Davy, but anybody I'd love to hear. So when I think about this poem in relation to social spaces and urban spaces in the Bay Area, I think of a supermarket in California, Allen Ginsberg. I think about Walt Whitman, who is really an early version of this social assumption making speaker, right? And of course, I think of Stein, the way Stein informed the language poets was to begin to seem to tell stories, narratives, and then of course, very quickly, it's no longer a story. And so in that sense, Scalapinos participating in not so much maybe, as Davy warned us, would be possibly a mistake, not so much maybe in parallel to friends and colleagues and generational cohort members of the so-called language group, but more like how someone putting narrative into question can derive from a poet like Stein. So telling a story, I was in a downtown area once upon a time, and then doing all those things Erica just described to break it apart. So I've thrown out Ginsberg and the city and the encounter in this particular area. I've thrown out the comparison to the Whitmanian in the city, and I've thrown out a comparison to language poetry. You think about a ModPo Plus poem like Bart by Ron Silliman. So Bart is cruising around on the BART system, the train, through this same area and making all kinds of other social observations. So Davy, pick one of those, and then I'll go to Camara and Lily and Erica.
Of those options, I'm gonna hang out with a supermarket in California. And the reason that it occurs to me as a pretty interesting comparison is that I read that poem as a poem in which Ginsberg, and I'm curious as to what others think about this, Ginsberg feels like, or the speaker of that poem feels like they really belong in the supermarket. They have no question about whether or not it's okay that they're in the supermarket. And they're interested in thinking about how other people use the space or critiquing how others use the space. But we don't hear the speaker of that poem asking, is it okay for me to be here? Is my body on the line in this space? Do I belong? And something Camara that you said, and something Erica that you said, made me interested to think about some of the syntactic strategies of unbelonging or discomfort in this poem. That, Erica, something that I loved about what you said is that the kind of simultaneous embeddedness in narrative and impossibility of embeddedness enact for us in reading the poem the speaker's orientation that, Camara, you were talking about, of the speaker feeling at once involved in the space of the urban space that we get here and really repulsed by it. And so we get a poem in which, in experiencing the syntax of the poem, the reader is in the position of simultaneous participation and unbelonging. And we get something that I think is pretty rare, at least in the ModPo archive, which is a poem that engages in social observation from the speaker's own perspective of discomfort or unbelonging, a person who's making observations and targeting and profiling others, while also feeling profiled and targeted and kind of unsure. And that's a kind of uncertainty that I don't experience in a supermarket in California that I think is really helpful here to think about what does it mean to have observations of and like syntactic rupture of a relationship to urban space in which you feel like you're not sure whether or not your body should be there.
Yeah. A footnote to that wonderful comment, Davy, would be the relationship between the speaker who's in the supermarket there in that Ginsberg poem and this one. There, that speaker is just unironic and naive about and happy about all the plenitude. Well, maybe it's not totally unironic, but it seems pretty happy about all that plenitude, because plenitude suggests a kind of Whitmanian multiplicity. And, you know, it turns out to be a very sad thing in the end, because the person is quite lonely. But being in the supermarket kind of, you know, it's like a happy consumerist moment. And here, this person doesn't even want to go into the store, you know. Anyway, thank you, Davy. Camara, I threw out the connection to the Whitmanian speaker who wanders around the cities and, you know, kind of does his presumptuous magic. And I threw out the Ginsberg. I also threw out Stein and the language poets and this whole problem of telling stories. Which one of those do you want to talk about?
You also threw out Bart. Could we talk about Bart?
Yeah, sure, please. Great, I did do that. Yeah, good.
Well, I was thinking just with that poem, I was thinking also formally, like the long sentence, right?
Yeah.
Compared to this, which I haven't read the poem in full, and I bet it is long, but the difference between that like long sentence of observation versus these sort of not shorter sentences, but definitely shorter than those sentences. And
Yeah.
I think that briefness and brevity and comparison sort of also speaks to the assumptions being made, but also the breaks that the speaker is giving to the reader to like read each sentence as its own type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just something I was thinking of in terms of formally compared to this and Bart.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. There's a lot of showing off in Bart, that is to say that you're very aware that this speaker is trying to write a single sentence while spending the whole day on the Bart. And
Right.
So there's a certain amount of self-congratulating virtuosity in that experiment, whereas there's a little less of that here. Lily, Bart, Whitman, Ginsberg, Stein to the language poets.
I like being presented with this menu of options. I'm going to obviously
I told
defer.
you it was a game, you know.
I love games. I'm going to defer Stein to Erica, obviously, should you want to take that up. But I've been thinking about what Davy said about Ginsberg in the supermarket, and in that poem, he calls Whitman in as a reference. And I think the same thing Davy said about Ginsberg's bodily position in the supermarket, feeling pretty comfortable and safe there. Like, same applies. Obviously, this is a big critique we make of Whitman. Like, what I assume you shall assume, everyone, like, there's this democratic freedom of like, everyone could be the subject of my poem, but they're still the subject of my poem. And like, I describe them in the way that you would also describe them if you were here or something. Whereas obviously Scalapino is resisting that because she is really grounding this speaker in their own discomfort, like we were already talking about. But I also wanted to say that not every figure that's being described is being celebrated for some sort of like exuberant beauty. There is like a darkness or a danger to some of the figures, and some of the figures are threatening in certain environments in ways that are troubling. So that's very different from a, you know, what I shall assume, you shall assume, I celebrate and sing myself type of a Whitmanian vibe from Songs of Myself.
Thank you, Lily. Erica, you've been put in the position of having to speak to this question of the Steinian in Leslie Scalapino. And I think Lynn Haginian also participates in the Steinian there at the same time, at the same generation, the same aesthetic grouping. Or this whole thing about language poetry gesturing towards story, but winding up being very paratactic and disjunctive.
Well, you know, of course, Leslie, and it's true of Lynn Haginian too, were both very influenced by Stein. And, you know, when I was rereading this poem for today, I was rereading it right after I had just had a class in which I taught Stein's essay, Composition as Explanation, which I believe is in ModPo. And I was really struck by how many overlaps there seem to be, particularly how Stein talks repeatedly about how, you know, everything is the same except composition and time. And I think that you see hints of that in the Scalapino, where, you know, whether or not things are described in the same way, the way that she's composing is changing. I'm not being very clear, but what I'm trying to get at is it seems like there's something happening in the way that she's using syntax, where through making these narrative statements, she's then using the form of the statement to lead to an image that temporally displaces the statement.
Wow.
Makes
Wow,
sense?
we should transcribe this, if only to get what you just said in writing. That was really fabulous.
Well, you know, I'm also thinking about in 2007, Trace Peterson and I had a panel as part of the Segue reading series on language, poetry, and the body. And Leslie Scalapino was one of our panelists, and she talked a lot about how time is important to her, particularly because of the way that she can employ I-driven narrative as a way to disrupt time and consequently disrupt hierarchical forms of sense making.
Wow.
And I just read this this text, and it just reminds me very much of that, you know, that sensation as a reader of feeling simultaneously inside and outside.
Yes, that's really great. Wow. Okay. So what we're going to do now, and you got to promise these are lightning rounds. We're going to have 3 lightning rounds, and lightning is like, you know, say one thing, because we'll never get to it if we 3 lightning rounds. The first lightning round each of us will be picking a phrase or a sentence, just mostly to commend it, to commend people watching this video and reading this poem to take a closer look. That'll be the first. So yeah, you do a close reading of it, but make it quick, lightning round. The second will be a quick answer to the question, why read this? That is, what could we get out of this? Why can't you just read a microfiction in the New Yorker or something? Because, you know, I was in a downtown area and I saw a person with sweet rolls and, you know, tell a story and finish it up and collect the big paycheck from the New Yorker and you're all set. Why read this? And the third round will be final thoughts, but they'll have to be lightning round final thoughts. So I'll start with the line, and it follows from the brilliant thing that Erica Kaufman said. Erica, what did you eat your Wheaties today? You're rocking it. Maybe you didn't talk about poetry enough with all your meetings today. I think that's it. This responds, my lightning round choice responds to what Erica just said about time. It's, I had something I had to do later. That is just brilliant, because if you try to parse out the verb forms and the tense and where we're going, and I had something I had to do, technically you can talk about the future and use the had, but it definitely throws you off in a way that just makes you think, you know, she's walking, the speaker's walking, there were people at a bus stop, they weren't going to work, so they're just walking around, you know, affluent types. I had something I had to do later. I'm not one of those. I don't know who I am. I just love that. Okay. Lily, got a lightning round sentence?
Yes. I really love the last sentence of the second stanza. She should be shopping rather than myself, and she was walking rather fast so that she was with the people ahead of me. It just really is a fantastic way to begin the poem, because for the section, because it almost reminds me of like if you cover one eye or something and you look at a scene and you collapse the perspective, because the woman she's observing isn't out for the day with the people ahead of her, but she may as well be if she's moving fast and apart from me. So I thought that was really cool.
That was really great. Great. Camara, you got a line for us?
Yeah, a line that maybe makes me uncomfortable that I think, encourages other people to sit with too. The last line of the first page we're looking at, a retarding of his ability in general, not just in this setting, and have other people who were there wearing everyday clothes walking some. Yeah, I don't really know what to do with this line, but I'm thinking about and not just in this setting part of it, and how where is the setting is sort of all over the place. The setting of the poem, the setting, the normal state that this person is in compared to the in this language of ability and sexuality that Davy was talking about earlier, but
Yeah.
also the ending of walking some.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I love that. Yeah. That is really great. Good choice. Davy, lightning round line.
Mine is on this, the second page of this excerpt. They shouldn't move or should walk around some, though their sexual life should occur with someone from outside, which is a sentence that I love because it's really unclear to me how the two halves of that sentence fit together. And it's like in the first half of that sentence, they shouldn't move or should walk around some. Is that prescriptive? Is that a sense of like, I'm deciding what people in urban space should do? Is it just indicating an expectation of urban space in which like all observations of urban space are in some way in dialogue with the viewer's expectation or the observer's expectation of what happens in cities? And a kind of a question of like, is this behavior that I would expect? Is it not behavior that I would expect? It's really unclear what it has to do with the second half of this sentence. And the work that though does is so interesting to me. And also it's unclear where outside is. Are we already outside? Do we mean like all the people that we're seeing in the poem? Do we mean outside some kind of social group? Do we mean a person who has an outsider status? In which case, what does that mean?
Right.
It's a lot of the uncertainty that occurs in the poem feels like it's compressed into this line for me, which is why I think it's interesting.
Thank you. I'm going to break the lightning round rule and ask you a follow-up to that, Davey, really quickly before we turn to Erica for Erica's line. And that is, as an urbanist or as a scholar of urban spaces and movement through spaces like that, how does it make you feel when a writer you admire is specifically locating herself through writing in an urban space, set of spaces, but causes you not to know where she is within, is disorienting you even to the point of you're not knowing whether she's inside or outside? How does that make you feel?
I mean, I can't answer this without also speaking a little bit to your second question, so I'll try to do the really short job. But it makes me feel excited because Scalapino is so embedded in her practice of trying to exactly describe the procedures of perception. And I think that that's a kind of information about urban space, what is happening in someone's thought pattern when they perceive urban space, and that her total refusal of an objective narrative of observing urban space is so useful. So it makes me feel excited about that.
Great. Thank you for the brief answer, but I had to throw that out there. Erica, your favorite line?
Am I allowed to pick the title of this section?
Oh yeah, you better, because we haven't talked about it.
I just absolutely love the idea that she calls this coming sequence, but then begins in the past tense. I was in a downtown area.
Yeah, I mean, coming is such a powerful word there. Yeah, that's really great. Coming sequence. I love it. And that really answers that question about how this poet or this so-called language poet is going to deal with narrative. Coming sequence. Okay, another lightning round. This has got to be really lightning-like. Why? Why read this? Why not just read something that is a straight out, why don't we read Jane Jacobs, who is a great radical, but not as a writer. Jane Jacobs wrote social observation. This is not Jane Jacobs, although it shares some of the concerns. So who wants to start? Why read it? Lily, why?
I think let me see. I think something about this, the way this poem is utilizing narrative and subjectivity, means we're not beholden to come up with a whole backstory for each character or figure who's named in a way we might expect from a work of fiction. And I think Scalapino is playing so beautifully with the impermanence and changes and what you can observe in a city as a city resident, in a way that in a story you would be so beholden to like explain why you were looking at a person or give a little bit more info or context for them.
Nice. That's just such a great answer. Camara, what's your thought? Why read this? Why would you recommend this to a friend or a family member?
Well, I think that this poem sort of gets at the discomfort. I keep going back to the discomfort and disgust that David was talking about earlier. It's brilliant. That the reader gets when reading this and thinking about the perception of the observer. And I think that sort of like discomfort is really productive and maybe won't get brought up in reading like a sociological study or like a fiction, but like the reader itself feeling like lost and inside outside of this grammar, really.
Yes.
That's specific.
Nicely put. You know, I mean, I think in general, this is an obvious thing for ModPo people to want to say, but you know, anytime any kind of omniscience is challenged or broken apart or questioned, omniscience in the sense of a speaker or a narrator that knows everything, one would want to recommend that because omniscience is bullshit. Maybe I should be a spiritual believer and believe in some omniscience, but I don't. And the city seems to have been set up to defy omniscience in a way. How could you ever know a city? You know, totally. Thank you. Erica, why?
I think because instead of what we're used to, which is the use of narrative to tell a specific story, Scalapino's text challenges, and I think Camara was also saying this, but challenges the reader to ask questions.
Yes, that's great.
It changes the relationship to story and narrative.
Yeah. Davy, I've lost track. Did you talk about why? Please do.
No, but I'll just echo something that both Camara and Erica are saying is that I think in addition to encouraging us to ask questions, the reason that I would recommend this, the reason that I would teach it is that it forces us to talk about bias, that this is a really biased, problematic speaker, and yet is someone whose language I'm interested in thinking about and with. And I think that if we think about Scalapino and Jane Jacobs, though not necessarily the speaker because we don't know, as white women, Jacobs says, as a white woman, I can observe my neighborhood in Lower Manhattan and make recommendations about what's best for everyone's experience of urban space. And there's 60 years of critique that deal with that. And the speaker of this poem doesn't make recommendations about what everyone's city should be like, even though this is a really prescriptive speaker. And this is a speaker who makes evident some of the real problems with first-person observation of urban space that aren't solvable, that for my observations of urban space, my observations are endlessly foreclosed by my whiteness. And that's just true. And that's something that is necessary to the way that I engage with space. It is going to produce problematic forms of viewing urban space, and getting students to be able to talk about the endemic unsolvable problems about how people disagree about what cities are is so important. And I think this poem does a great job of teasing out some of where it's just impossible to agree about what cities are, and where city observation is just constituted by the bias and subject position endemic to viewers.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, final thoughts, but this has got to be super, like a lightning strike. I mean, like, final thought. So I guess it's really an invitation to say one thing that you wanted to say but didn't have a chance to, but briefly. Lily, what's your final thought?
My quick thought is to add to the list of other ModPo refs that would be fun to bring into conversation with this. I might add A Step Away From Them by Frank O'Hara as a comparison for what a person walking through a city observing others who are and aren't like them, and with kind of a sexual vibe going through.
Well, there's a construction worker that the speaker really likes to look at.
Yeah, exactly. That might be an interesting comparison.
Nice. Oh, I love that. That's like what you can do after watching this video. That's really cool. Okay. Camara, final thought?
I'm thinking about the repeated sort of phrase that's throughout, so that I had a feeling that, and I just kept on skipping over the that, and I kept on being like, add the that back in, and I think that that's just an example of the way that Scalapino is trying to make us syntactically a little uncomfortable, and what that has to show about her as a viewer and a perceiver and sort of translator of the city in this piece. Nice.
Yeah, that almost goes back to a why. Why would you read this? Because we all need a translator. To translation sounds almost too authoritative, but someone who can put into other words what your experience is like. Thank you, Erica. Final thought.
I've been sort of toying around in my head what she's up to with pronouns and how the speaker is not at all gendered and the piece itself is very gendered. And that seems to be very intentional on Scalapino's part. And it also seems to be a feminist gesture to me, but my thinking hasn't quite pushed forward to say more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really great. That caps off something we've been working at the edges of. Davy, final thought?
My final thought is going to hang out with Lily's final thought, which I love. And I think it would be really fun to think about this poem in dialogue with a step away from them. And I think it would enable us to do something that's, I think, both really necessary with this poem and also kind of slippery and hard, which is think about the way that race operates in a poem in which we get no racial language. And A Step Away from Them is a poem in which O'Hara's, I'm going to just say O'Hara's latent anti-Blackness really comes out. And that's something that, like, O'Hara is a really exoticizing viewer of others and of racialized others in urban space. And racialization isn't as clear to me in this poem as it is in A Step Away from Them. But I think that thinking about those poems together issues an invitation to think about the set of, between the New York School poets in ModPo and the language poets and language associated poets, language oriented poets like Scalapino, who might not identify as language writers, an opportunity to have a couple of different groups of largely, though not entirely, white poets who are engaging largely, though not entirely, with urban space, and to think about what it means to have this group of white writers and what it means to talk explicitly about the way that they observe people of color in majority cities of color in the Bay Area and in New York.
That's great. My final thought follows from that. I mean, it should be stipulated that this conversation, which I hope will last many years and people will watch it well into the future, is occurring in the middle of 2020, where we have renewed, much needed, renewed conversation about racial injustice and about actual profiling by people in authority, and a presidential election. And I'm sort of awash in polls, and polls are all about, the sense I had of this person is that, he's has this set of values, could go this way, is, upwardly mobile, et cetera, these kind of assumptions that people make. And this is really a kind of proactively thinking about that. The sense I had of Man on the Street was that he had a family, yet was ambivalent toward the place or setting of that moment, an area where there were small businesses and restaurants. He feels out of place in a place with, I guess, boutiques or whatever, and is not where he lives. What the fuck, Like that, you're right. Race and class are really fundamental to this speaker's thinking. And to be able to say definitively, this is the sense I had, is that this person doesn't live here. This person could feel a little out of place or be anxious or find out he forgot his wallet, and so he's kind of not sure he should go into a store or whatever. There could be all kinds of reasons why he seems not to have live there. And the assumption that he doesn't is exactly what's troubling about this, as you've all said. Well, thank you all. This was really great. And thank you especially to Davy, who did the work of finding a short ModPo-sized piece of Leslie Scalapino, who writes long pieces, and thus can enter the ModPo Plus canon in a way that I think is very productive. So thank you, Davy, Camara, thank you, Lily, and Erica.